بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم. We greet you from my sitting room here in the Caribbean island of Trinidad with Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And today's subject is a somber one, it's a difficult one, and we have to take our time today in addressing the subject of Ukraine once again, because events are now unfolding increasingly dangerously, and I owe a duty to my students and to the viewing audience in different parts of the world to update them and to give them my views based upon my understanding of the Quran and of the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, Allah's blessing be upon him. I am conscious of the fact that there are many who are not Muslims who are also now viewing these videos, and so I have to try to translate whenever I use an Arabic term, to translate it and explain it. Our topic is Ukraine, the just war, the just war, and international law. And the background for choosing this topic is that Russia has just announced a partial mobilization of troops, about 300,000. And that is a very clear indication of the clouds of war. And I'm talking about the big war. Since February, what we had was a Russian military intervention in Ukraine, and it was forced upon Russia. There was no alternative left for Russia. Russia did everything she could to try to avoid it, to resolve the problem. Not only was there a problem of oppression, and we have a lot to talk about that, oppression in those parts of Ukraine which did not accept the bogus coup d'etat that took place in 2014, financed from abroad, to overthrow a government in Ukraine which was friendly to Russia, and to replace it with one which was monstrously hostile to Russia. And this was not acceptable to so many people in Ukraine who were Russian speaking for themselves, and they were considered themselves to be a part of Russia ancestrally. And because these people refused to accept it and resisted that coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014, what Ukraine responded with was the same kind of oppression that you have in India and Kashmir. And so there was war in Ukraine going on between the government of Ukraine and those who resisted the change in government. And people were being killed, war was going on. And this went on for 7 years, 7 long years, until eventually Russia intervened to liberate these people from oppression. And we're going to have to deal with that subject today. I don't know how long it will take. But there was also another reason for Russia's intervention, and that is Ukraine was moving in the direction of joining the military alliance that was hostile to Russia, namely the North American Treaty Alliance, NATO, Treaty Organization, NATO. And Russia was warning and warning and warning, we will not allow this. This is an unacceptable security threat to Russia. And so after all the warnings had been ignored by the Western world, and they said, no, Ukraine has the right to join NATO and you can't stop it. And then eventually, when there was no other option left, Russia, in order to save her own people, Russian-speaking people in Ukraine, from oppression. It doesn't matter whether they're Russians or not, any people who are being oppressed, Russia has the right, according to God's law, which is our topic today, according to God's law, to intervene to liberate the oppressed. And Russia also had a right to ensure that her own security as a state was not threatened in such a significant way. And so this is the reason why there was a military intervention in February. And 6 months have passed, it is, and now we find that the war, it's no longer an intervention, it's a war, because Russia has now published that almost 6,000 of their soldiers have been killed in this war. So it is a war. We don't know what are the figures for Ukraine, but Russia has told us these are the numbers who have been killed. So you have a war in Ukraine, and now the war is about to escalate. And that's what I want to explain to you before we proceed. And that is those parts of Ukraine which have been liberated from oppression. And I use my words carefully, liberated from oppression. They are now, as I speak, they're voting in referendums that these territories become a part of Russia. It's a foregone conclusion. These people have been suffering for 7 years, and now they're getting a chance to be free from oppression. So obviously they would want to have a security of being a part of Russia to ensure that they're never again a part of Ukraine. That's why they'll all vote to join, that the territory become a part of Russia. When the referendums are completed in a few days' time, then the Russian parliament will have to decide whether or not to accept them and make them, these territories, a part of Russia. It matters not to the Russian people. It matters not at all to the Russian parliament whether the United States accepts or does not accept, whether Britain accepts or does not accept this joining Russia. That's irrelevant. That is totally irrelevant. These are not the people who rule the world, and they certainly don't rule Russia. They don't rule China. They don't even rule India today. They don't rule Iran. They don't rule Venezuela. They don't rule Korea. They don't rule so many other parts of the world anymore, and they would not understand it. The day of the universal policeman is coming to an end. So whether they accept or does not accept is irrelevant to the subject. What is relevant is how Russia responds, and if Russia accepts these territories to be incorporated into the Federation of Russia, then they become a part of Russian territory. As soon as they become a part of Russian territory, the Constitution of Russia gives to the government of Russia the obligation to protect every part of Russia. So once Ukraine now proceeds to continue the war against these territories, you're now waging war on Russia. And Russia has announced that we are going to defend our land, defend our country by all means necessary. And so you have a road now leading almost certainly to nuclear war, because Russia is not fighting the government of Ukraine alone. The entire Western world, you know, the modern Western civilization, my Islamic eschatology based on the Quran, led me to the conclusion long ago that modern Western civilization was created by the Antichrist, by Dajjal, the false Messiah. And our Prophet has described Dajjal, the Antichrist. The Christians, of course, would be interested in this information. He said that Dajjal has the word kafir written on his forehead. And every believer, that is one who has faith in his heart. And those who say that a man can marry another man and get a marriage certificate, they don't have any faith in their heart. So he said that every believer would be able to read the word kafir and recognize, therefore, that modern Western civilization is a civilization based on kufr or blasphemy, the rejection of faith. And He says you'll be able to read the word kafir whether you are katib or ghayru katib, means whether you are literate or you are illiterate. You'll still be able to read it. So those who do not have internal insight, they will not be able to recognize that they belong to a civilization created by Dajjal, the Antichrist, and it is a civilization founded on kufr, or the rejection of faith. And the Prophet went on to say about that, the people of kufr, he says, al-kufru millatun wahida, that all of these people who are in the religion, the state of kufr, they all constitute one community, one political community. Millatun wahida. So Russia is not fighting Ukraine alone at all. Russia is fighting the whole of modern Western civilization. The power of modern Western civilization is behind Ukraine. So this is a confrontation between Russia and the rest of the West. And as soon as the referendums are over, as soon as the territories become a part of Russia, then if Ukraine continues to attack these territories, we're going to see a massive and a significant and an instantaneous escalation of the war in Ukraine. And this is a road leading clearly to nuclear war, because Russia has said we're going to defend our territory by any means necessary, by all means necessary. It is in this background that we now address this subject. I don't think that there is any possibility left for a peaceful resolution of the war in Ukraine. There are those who are still optimistic, and I admire them for their optimism. But my pragmatic view of the subject is that we've now passed the point of no return. The situation as it now exists is that Russia has accepted that this war cannot be avoided, the Great War. It's a confrontation with the West. And the mobilization of troops in Russia is an indication as plain as daylight that Russia is now preparing for the Great War. That's right. Had it been possible for them to sit together and talk, Russia and Ukraine, yes, Russia and Ukraine, as I think took place in February or March, there was still a possibility that some peaceful resolution to the problem could be achieved. But the Western world did not want Ukraine to agree to any peace terms with Russia, because they wanted Russia to be defeated. And now Ukraine has announced very plainly and clearly, we are not prepared to negotiate until we defeat Russia on the battlefield. So we don't want to solve this problem peacefully. We want a military solution for the problem. That is Ukraine's position. And therefore Russia cannot be blamed now if there are no negotiations possible to try to resolve the conflict, the war. I have explained the Russian side. Number one, the threat to security. Number two, the oppression of the people. Now look at the Western world. They are arguing, and this is why the topic of this video is Ukraine, the just war and international law. The Western world is arguing, based on the United Nations Charter and based on international law, that borders of states are sacrosanct, that you can have no violation of the territorial integrity of a state, that if you if Russia has occupied parts of Ukraine, there can be no peaceful resolution of this war unless and until Russia withdraws her troops from Crimea and withdraws her troops from all those territories where the people were being oppressed for 7 long years. Will Russia ever do that? It is time for us now to take a look at the subject from the perspective of truth in the Quran. When I was a student at the Graduate Institute of International Studies, and even before that at the Institute of International Relations of the University of the West Indies, where, mashallah, I had wonderful teachers at the Institute of International Relations of the University of the West Indies. I have very fond memories of Professor Dr. Leslie Manigat, who is the director of the Institute from Haiti and who had his PhD from the Sorbonne. I was delighted with that 1 year that I had at the University of the West Indies. I couldn't find such teachers when I went to the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva. But I had to study international law, not only here at the University of the West Indies, the Institute of International Relations, but I also had to do 1 year of international law at the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva. I remember that my professor was a woman from Poland. And so I therefore have some introduction to international law. And what I found is that it is the same thing with international law as it is with political theory and economic theory that I studied. That politics and economics and law, as taught by the Western world, are devoid of any moral foundation. There is no link between politics and morality, between economics and morality, between law and the moral order. There was a politician in Trinidad, whose name I will not mention, who famously declared, he says, politics has its own morality. So it's a very, very famous comment. Politics has its own morality. So I was astonished in the classroom to see it was devoid of the moral law in politics, in economics, and in international law. And so when they say the territorial frontiers are sacrosanct, that you cannot occupy any part of a nation's territory at all through warfare, there can be no resolution to the problem unless you withdraw. That if you have a government who is behaving badly, then the way to deal with it is the way that a rat behaves. You know, a rat operates in the dark. So they will send their operators and they'll operate in the dark and they'll have a color revolution, as they did in Ukraine, as they did in Iran in 1952, in so many other parts of the world. And they will overthrow the government. That's right. And then they'll recognize the new government very quickly. But the law with Allah is different, that you don't operate like a rat. You have to show integrity. You have to operate in accordance with the moral law. The law of nations must conform with the moral law. And so today we want to look at whether or not, based on the Quran, whether or not Russia was justified in intervening militarily in Ukraine. What does the Quran say on the subject of a just war? What does the Quran say on the subject of the moral foundations of the conduct of state? I want to turn to Surah As-Sad of the Quran. I'm going to give you the number of the verse as well.